Welcome to our first lesson for the week, and this is Teaching Methods of English. I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope to see you back when this lockdown is up. I really miss the actual face-to-face interaction with everybody, or maybe we should have an online live lesson one of these days. We can, if you have access, we'll think about that for sometimes make a decision on whether we should have a lesson live or not. But that's going to depend on how many people have got enough data to sustain the lesson, the 1 hour lesson. All right. So what is our agenda for today? The first thing that we're going to look at is the lesson structure. How is the lesson structured? And then this is specifically for this first lesson that we are having. And then we'll dive into the introduction of the new unit. It's unit 3 and it's on the history of language teaching. I should applaud you for doing the work. I have gone through the activity that you have done. Some of you have copied, unfortunately, and I don't think I have really emphasized on that because your work is exactly the same as everybody else, and that is really not acceptable. That is just not ethical, academically ethical. All right, so you have to mind the plagiarism, copying other people's, stealing other people's work. Next, we will look into the lesson presentation. Okay, we'll get into the lesson presentation. That is me presenting the lesson, and then recap of the aspects that we have covered within the presentation. All right, the lesson structure for today is going to be this way. I'll be presenting the lesson, so I appeal to you to listen attentively. And then to do that, I will advise you to take notes so that you don't get distracted. If not, be resourceful and find a place where you write your notes. And then here you write, things that stand out for you, things that you maybe, as you are reading the unit, that you do not understand. And then at the same time, you should also, write questions of things or terms or explanation that I give you that you did not understand. Please write those ones down as well. Within the lesson presentation, you will find questions that are embedded within the lesson presentation that I will say that you should answer in your notebooks. Because after all the 4 presentation of the lesson, the 4 lessons that I'm going to present this week, I will then ask you to post your answers on Moodle. All right. So this is really to keep you accountable for your own learning. Okay. All right. Unit 3 is about history of language teaching and some current methodological trends that are happening, that are being used at this point in time. And to cover this unit, our information is going to come from this textbook. You have already seen it on Dropbox for those of you who were able to access it. And then for some of you, I have posted the pictures of the unit that we're going to cover on the WhatsApp group. From this specific textbook, we're going to look at the first chapter in Unit 1. And then that specific chapter looks at the history of language teaching. And what are then our objectives? The first objective is for us to know some important terms, definitions. And then the second one is for us now to go over the teaching, the methods and approaches that have been used over the years when it comes to language teaching. And then we'll look into now the current teaching methods, teaching approaches that are used. And we will, when we look at that, we'll see now what fits our style, which approaches are going to be appropriate for our learners. And I'll advise you to try out different teaching methodologies for you also to see what works for you. And then, as we'll see at a later stage, there isn't one best specific or maybe I shouldn't say that. We'll talk about that later on as we, at the later stage. Let's just keep that exciting news. Definitions that we are going to look at are approaches, methods, and technique. So those are the first terms that we're going to look at, and we are going to look at them from the point of view of Anthony, who wrote these definitions in 1963. But mind you, these definitions or these terms are still used today. All right, and then, all right, let's start with approach. What is approach? According to Anthony, approach is what gives us the theoretical model. All right, and then examples of theoretical models are, behaviorist, structural, cognitive, functional, etc. All right, so those are some of the examples of theoretical models that we have in language teaching. And then now when we look at approach, it gives us an idea of what theoretical model is being used. Or it can also give us a research paradigm that has been used, either positivist, constructivist, primitivist, or pragmatic, basically. These are the research paradigms, and these terms, we use them when it comes to language research, but you will get to know these terms when you start doing research methods, or when you begin to do your research in your 4th years. All right, you need to know these terms because they guide you on how to do the research. So within the approach, the approach then gives us a reflection of these two aspects: research paradigm or theoretical model. It also gives us a broad philosophical perspective on language teaching. And then we'll see, this philosophical perspective, as an example, we have communicative approach, and it's one of the approaches that we're going to look at the later stage when we dive into the approaches and methods for language teaching. It just gives us that broad aspect, that broad view of the philosophy behind, that specific approach. All right, and then the next term that we're going to look at is method, and it's a collection of steps on how to teach. All right, it's a set of procedures, and then there are certain methods. All right, there are certain methods that give us precisely the step-by-step. It's like it's a cookie cutter. You follow it step by step when you teach. All right, so the method gives you that, and examples of those methods that give you prescriptive steps that you need to follow when you teach are Silent Way and Suggestopedia. And then we'll see this at the later stage because they are also, among the approaches and methods that have been used over the years when it comes to language. And then when it comes to methods, because we say that we're going to look at three definitions: approach, method, and technique. So method, when it comes to method, is more specific than approach, because approach is more broad, as we have seen. It's like it's a theory. It's a broad theoretical method, for example, broad research methodology, or broad philosophical perspective that is being used. But then when it comes to method, it's more specific because it's giving you like the steps that you need to follow, for instance, when it comes to teaching. But then the third one that we're going to look at is technique, and technique is more specific than method. All right, and then we'll see what we mean by how is it specific, what does it entail exactly. And then when it comes to method, usually they are more compatible to either one or sometimes two approaches. So when it comes to a method, it might be coming from the point of view of either one approach, as we have seen before what an approach is, or two different approaches that has the same procedures or similar procedures, or the method is going to be informed by either one of the approaches or two approaches that make up that method. All right, and then the third one, the last definition that we're going to look at from Anthony is technique. What is a technique exactly? A technique is a specific classroom activity So do you see how specific it is compared to a method? Method is just a step of like what you need to follow. But then when it comes to technique, it's like you have to be more specific within with specific activity that you're going to follow in your lesson. When it comes to techniques, we do not just say that is used within one specific method. There are times when we have techniques that are used in various methods. All right, and then we'll see that when we begin to look at the different approaches that we have, that you see that in this method they use this specific technique, for example, diction, and then also this method also uses diction, and then this method uses listening and repeating drills, students saying let's say dialogues over and over, or phrases or sentences over and over. All right, that's what we mean by drill, saying it over and over. Or read the passage and fill in the blanks. You see that it's not just for a specific method, but it can be used for different methods. But then there are certain techniques that are being used, but then they are just used specifically for a certain method. For instance, we have got Cuisenaire rods, and then we'll see what those Cuisenaire rods are in silent way. All right. Cuisenaire rods are specifically or usually used in silent way, and then you hardly use it. You hardly see it being used in other methods. All right, so this is now what we have on tech. And then I will advise you to always pause the video for a little bit to either process what you've just learned, or write your questions if you have any questions of something that you did not understand. All right, the second set of definitions that we're going to look at are method. All right, and then method is divided into three terms: approach, design, and procedure. And then these definitions have been created by Richards and Rogers, and they were created recently in 2001. So what are they? So this is the hierarchy of method. We have got method, and then we've got approach, design, and procedure. And then when we look at these definitions, we'll then see that some of the terms are somewhat related. Now, the difference between these definitions compared to the ones given by Anthony is that these ones are more detailed. They are very specific, more detailed when it comes to definitions. And they are in many ways related. They are not, they are somewhat related or completely different because it's not used in their definitions, or maybe it's just a different terms, different name that have been used, like design compared to approach, method, and technique. And here we've got procedure, for example. You see, the relation, the similarities, and I think we have done an activity on that, so you probably know some of those similarities. So we are going to look at approach. According to now Richard and Rogers, approach gives you an idea or gives you the theory of the nature of language. In other words, it answers the questions of what is the nature of language proficiency. It looks at language proficiency and then what entails language proficiency. And then it also answers the question when we're looking at the theory of the nature of language. It also looks at, what are the basic units when it comes to language structure for each, for each specific approach. What are the basic units? What are the components when it comes to language structure? What components of language structure do they look at? All right, so that's what is covered under theory of language nature. And then the second aspect, we have the nature of language learning. And then when it comes to theory of language, when we look at that, then so one of the aspects that the theory of language nature or the language learning cover is what are some of the psycholinguistics and cognitive processes that are involved in language learning. When it comes to language learning, we have things like cognitive and psycholinguistic processes that I trust you should have learned by now. You should have modules that cover things like psycholinguistics and cognitive processes that are involved in language learning. All right, so I hope you do, and if you don't, please do ask me. All right, so when it comes to the theory of the nature of language learning, we look at some of the processes that are involved in some of the processes, and these specific processes are psycholinguistics and cognitive that are involved in language learning. And then the other aspect that you look at under this second point is what are the conditions that a learner needs to successfully learn a language. All right, so these are the things that are covered within an approach according now to Richards and Roger. All right, in some ways you can see how it's somewhat related to the approach and the approach definition by Anthony, that it looks at the broader, because when you're looking at psycholinguistics, the condition that is more broad, those are more broad thinking or broad frameworks that are related to language learning. All right. And then moving on to the second one is design. According to Richards and Rogers, design looks at the general and specific objective of the method, like what does it aim to accomplish. And then the second aspect that it looks at is the syllabus, all right, the syllabus model. You know, when we looked at syllabus, we didn't really get into the different types of syllabus that we have, because when we are going to teach, we have this prescriptive syllabus that we need to follow. We really don't have a say on which syllabus to choose when it comes to teaching. Nonetheless, some of the examples of syllabus that we have are productive or product-oriented or grammatical oriented or process-oriented syllabus, or lexical or situational syllabus. As you can listen to, those different syllabus, it will give you an idea of how the content is going to be arranged. For instance, if we have got a grammatical oriented syllabus, what do you think are some of the content aspects that are going to be covered? Correct, if you have said grammatical aspects. All right, we are going to look at, let's say, tenses, inflection, verbs, conjugation, all that kind of stuff that are related, adjective, adverbs, nouns, pronouns, because it's grammatical. But then if we have got lexical, then it's going to cover aspects like vocabulary, words, learning within its structure. So in other words, the design also gives us an idea of the selection and organization of linguistic and subject matter. So the type of model, the syllabus model, it will give you an idea of what kind of criteria are they going to use to select the linguistic as well as the subject matter within the content of that design. All right, so that's what we have on design. And then the second aspect that is also the third aspect that is covered within design is the type of learning and teaching activities. So here it will just give you an idea of what kind of tasks as well as activities that are going to be used within the classroom. And then the next one is the role of the learner, the roles of the learners, if we change it into plural. And here we look at the involvement of the learners within the lesson. For example, what is their duty? How much control do they have on the content that they learn? Do they have a say on what they should learn or not? For example, what influence do they have on their own learning? What responsibilities do they have? What also influence do they have on other learners' learning? Do they collaborate in their learning, or do they just work independently? And also, we look at what is their function within the lesson. Are they going to be the performers? Are they going to be problem solvers? Or are they just going to sit there and then be filled with the knowledge from the teacher? Like, what is their role? Are they going to be initiators, or they're just going to be empty vessels that needs to be filled by the teacher? And then the next aspect that falls under design is teacher role. What is the function of the teacher within the lesson? All right. What does the teacher need to do in the lesson? How much influence do they have on the learner's learning? All right. How much influence do they have on choosing the learning content? And then also, how is their interaction between the teacher and the teacher, as well as the learners? So those are aspects now that are covered under design, and specifically under the role of teachers. And then the next one that we have is the role of the instructional material. So here, what is the function of the materials in the lesson? What do they do in the lesson? Do they overtake the lesson? Do they overtake the influence of the lesson in such a way that the teachers really don't say much? They depend entirely on the materials, and then also, what kind of materials are used in the lesson? Do they take a form of, let's say, a textbook, audio, visual? What type of materials are being used within that design? All right. And then, thinking about this, okay, you will just get an idea of if we have, for instance, audio. Okay, let's say we have got grammar translation as one of the methods. You see that grammar translation, as it will be described. It will be the design obviously would definitely be different from, because this one is like grammar translation. And then if we have got audio lingual, so this has something to do with audio listening and speaking. Obviously, those two designs are going to be totally different from each other. All right. And the role of, let's say, the teacher, the role of the learner, the role of the material, it's going to be definitely different from when you are comparing these two. And then the syllabus model obviously is going to be different. The general and specific objectives are going to be different because they have got they are informed by different frameworks. All right. So I'm just trying to make sense of what we have just covered under design. All right. And then if there's any confusion, please pause and then write your question and post it on the discussion discussion forum. So that's what we have now under design. So those are the 6 aspects that fall under design according to Richards. Moving on, we are going to look at procedures. So what is procedure exactly? Procedure is mainly the classroom techniques, practices, behavior that you will see when this method is being used. I've already told you about 2 examples of methods. We have got methods or approaches rather. We've got grammar translation. Some people call it method, some people call it approach. And then we have got, let's say, the audiolingual method. Just by the names of these approaches or methods rather, you can imagine that they are classroom techniques their practices and behaviors are going to be very different. All right, and this is now what falls under procedure. All right, and then to be more specific, when it comes to classroom techniques, practices, and behavior, we look at it in terms of the time, the spacing, the equipment that are being used within the lesson by, let's say, the teachers as well as the learners, and also the interaction, pattern between the teacher and the learner, or between the learners themselves. And then it also looks at the tactics and strategies that are being used by the learners as well as the teacher when it comes to this specific method that is going to be used. All right. And I think that this type of these definitions, this definition is really good because it gets you to think about the method in more details. All right. And I would say that you should know also Anthony's method, but I think I will, as we go on, we'll use this one more because it gives you more details of the method. It will make you think a little bit in depth about the method that you're going to cover. All right, so that's what we have regarding the definitions, and the definitions from Anthony as well as Richards and Ross. The first question that we have now for you to answer is, okay, it's a statement that you have to say whether the answer is true or false. So we have got this statement, definition of method by Anthony compares to the one by Richards and Rogers. They have the same exact meaning. Is this statement true or false? All right, write that down. The second question that we have is, according to Anthony, which of the following is the most specific? Is it approach? Is it method? Or is it technique? And then moving on, which of the following, the third question that we have is, which of the following provides the theoretical model or the theory of the nature of language? A, is it approach? B, is it procedure? C, is it technique? Fourth question, according to Richard, which of the following provides information about the classroom behavior, techniques, and practice? A, is it approach? B, is it design? C, is it process? All right, so those are our 4 questions, that definitions. Now we're going to move on to our next topic, which is the history of language teaching. So the first question that I'll have for you, do you think that it's necessary for us to learn about the history of language teaching? Yes or no? And please give your reason for that, just to get you thinking about this. Do you really need to learn about the history of language and of language teaching? Yes or no? And give your reason. About that, please pause the video and then answer the question in less than 5 minutes. I think it's gonna take more than 5 minutes. Okay, and let's move on. So why should we really learn about why should we learn about the history of language teaching? Why is it necessary? Okay, I hope you have done the activity before. To be honest, it's really necessary for us to learn about language teaching because it helps us be it helps us to be aware of the genesis, the origin of our profession, our art, teaching language. Like, where did it start? And how has it evolved over the years? And then it also allows us to know some of, the fundamental frameworks or underpinnings that many of these approaches use. All right. And then these fundamental frameworks or underpinnings are linguistics, psychological, and socio-cultural. All right. So as you read these approaches or methods, they will give you an idea of what underpinnings they are following when we are looking at these three specific underpinnings. And then the next one is that when you gain this knowledge of, the different underpinning of frameworks that have been used, when a new approach is developed, then approach or method is developed, then you evaluate it objectively. All right. You have some perspective to evaluate this so-called innovation or new approach that somebody will say that they have developed. All right. You have some perspective to use when you are evaluating or judging this new approach that has been developed. All right. You remember the characteristics of some of the approaches and methods that have been used over the years. And then this new method that is developed, you look at it from that point of view. And then you judge whether it's really a new approach or it has been borrowed. It has some characteristics that have been borrowed from the approaches and methods that have been used over the years. All right. And then also, if you want to develop your own method, you can have a foundation of the methods and approaches that have been already created. Also, when you are teaching in the classroom, you have an idea. You have an idea of what techniques, for example, or what design you can. So when you know about the other methods that have been used over the years, you can adapt those methods to suit your own teaching and learning environment. Do you understand? Like, you don't have to create one method from scratch, but you have so much information that from which you can derive your own method. When it comes to this language teaching methods and approaches, we have got two camps that these methods have been alternating, changing from. And those camps are, when you're teaching the learners a language, is for them to use the language. All right. That is now to say that when you teach them the language, they can use it in speech as well as in written form. And then when they use it, they understand it as well. All right. So that is the first camp. The second camp is, you teach the learners the language for them to analyze it. And what do we mean by that? To just learn the grammatical rules, of that specific or target language that you are teaching them. So those have been the camps that have been, used before the 20th centuries. And I think now, let me ask you this question. Which camp are we in the 21st century? Are we teaching the learners to just simply analyze the language, or are we teaching them to use the language with understanding? Which camp are we in? Or are we using both in the 21st century? So before the 20th century, that's what happened when it comes to approaches and methods that have been used. You either teach it or use it for that first specific reason, or you use it for that second specific reason. And then we'll see that when we look at the methods and approaches that have been used before the 20th century. And then the approaches were used to educate, the elite, like this, the high-end people, to be fluent in speaking, reading, and writing of classical languages. So that's now before the 20th century. That's the main reason why the learners were taught these specific languages, is to learn, to become fluent in speaking, reading, writing the classical languages. All right. That is Greek and Latin. That was the main reason. And then when it came to the Renaissance time period, and that is now 1300 to 1600. The focus was mainly on analyzing the language, the analysis of the language. And in the 17th century, the focus shifted to mainly speaking and understanding it. Do you see like the shift there? Like it's always bouncing from. And then these approaches and methods have an influence on the teaching and learning of the language. It's like, you know, a certain period of time. It's like whatever method and approaches that they use, it's focused on either one of the two camps that we've spoken about. And then when it falls under a certain camp, either language for analysis, then the methods are going to influence how you learn the language, because it's a method that's being used and you have to follow it. And if it's for understanding, then obviously it's going also, when you are learning the language, it's going to influence how you learn a language, or you teach it if you are the instructor, if you were the instructor. And then some of the approaches now used before the 20th century were developed. When people created these methods, is because they thought that, you know, the previous approaches or methods lacked something. That's why they have they do create these new approaches. Or they think that, oh, this method that had been used before is just straight up impractical, like it cannot be used. So they create new method. So it's like that's the premise for people developing new approaches. And then the 20th and the 21st century approaches were somewhat developed as a reaction to the inadequacy or impracticality of these approaches. All right. So, I mean, the idea is basically this. So in the 21st century, like now, if you are to create a new approach, okay, you will see that, okay, for you to create something new is because you think that, you know, for you to create, let's say, a method or an approach that is new, is because you think that, you know, the previously created methods are not usable, or they are just not going to work within your context, right? But then before you create that, you should have some theory. That's why we looked at like theoretical models that is going to inform your approach. You just don't create an approach out of the blue, but there should be some theoretical, researched models or underpinning or framework that are based on research that are going to inform your approach. So these are going to be the central principles that are going to guide the teaching and the learning of the language. All right, I hope that makes sense. But nowadays, for whatever approach that you use, there should be some theoretical underpinning that are going to be central principles that are going to guide how the language is going to be taught, and how the language is going to be learned, and how the language is going to be used. All right, so that's the point that I'm trying to make here. Now we're going to move on to the next aspect, that is now what approaches and methods were used then. All right, over the years, we have got 11 of those. We have got grammar translation approach, the direct method approach, the reform movement, the reading approach, the audiolingual approach. We have got the oral situation approach. We have got the cognitive approach, effective humanistic approach, comprehension-based approach, and the communicative approach, which is still used now. And some of those other ones are also used, but they are not as popular. Communicative approach is the one that is more popular today. And the last but not least is the design method. And this design method is taken. It's grouped as such because it have got different characteristics that other approaches really don't abide to. All right. Now, today we are going to look at 3 approaches, and those the 3 approaches that we're going to look at today is grammar translation approach, the direct method approach, as well as the reform movement. So Grammar translation, okay, when it comes to grammar translation, it was created in the 19th century. Yeah, that's grammar translation, yes, in the 19th century. And it was used mainly to teach classical languages. Like, that's the main focus of it. And some of the key characteristic of grammar translation is that, instructions were given in the native language of the learners. All right. When it comes to teaching, you use the learner's native language. And then also the other aspect is that the target language, that is now the language that you are teaching in your class, is rarely used for the purpose of communication. All right. And then the when it comes to these lessons, the focus is mainly on, let's say, when it comes to, when the focus is on grammar, the main focus that people concentrate on is the forms as well, the inflections of the words. All right. And then within the grammar translation approach, from the very beginning, of the teaching, the beginning stages of teaching, the learners already start reading difficult texts. Translation falls in the analysis of language. So if you are doing grammar, that is the main focus. So if you know that, okay, this is a plural subject, then you know the inflection is going to be different on the verb, for example. Or if it's a past tense, the inflection is going to be different in a certain way. Even if you don't understand really, like, let's say if you know in English that the verb ends with ed, even if you don't understand what that verb means, it's some like new verb, but as long as you know that it's ed, then you just put ed there without so much of understanding. And then even if you know the language, we never use it for communication purpose. All right. It's not for speaking, really, per se. So what are some of the typical activities or exercises that you get in this class? You have sentences that needs to be translated from one language, from the native language, for example, into the target language, or from the target language into the native language. And then, we already say that the learners have to use the language for communication. And when it comes to this type of teaching, obviously the teacher doesn't need to be fluent in that target language. The target language is like, okay, for example, for us, because we're going to be English teachers, let's say target language is English. So when you're going to teach this language, you don't need to be fluent because of the type of activity that it is, the behavior that is involved, the techniques that are being used in the lesson. Like, you don't have to be fluent in the language. That's now according to this unit that we have. The next approach is direct method. Direct method began at the end of the 19th century. Remember, that one began in the 19th century. Now, towards the 19th century, we have got the direct method. And then some of the key characteristics of the direct method is that, the native language, it's not allowed whatsoever in the lesson. So which means that there is no translation whatsoever or explanation in the mother tongue of the learners. And then the next one is that teachers start the lesson with, let's say, so some of the activities that you have in the lesson is that the lesson starts with a short story or a dialogue in a conversation type of style, and then this conversation is like modern. It's not archaic, all right? Like things that were happening at that time. And then to ensure understanding of meaning, the teachers, because remember, we do not use the native language of the learners, the mother tongue of the learners. So to help now the learners understand, and for the teacher to understand what the learners are saying, the learners are trying to communicate, is for both the teachers and the learners to use, let's say, action, the body language, as well as the picture. Realia is used in the lesson to help with conveying meaning of what is being said. And then the learners learn grammar inductively. I wonder if you know what inductive is. Let me just give you a few seconds there to think, what is inductive as opposed to deductive? All right, you are correct if you say that you implicitly learn something, which means that whatever, let's say in this case, when it comes to grammar, it's not like the rules are not explicitly taught to the learners. All right, so you just learn it as, let's say if you are reading a book, then you learn the grammar without anybody explaining to you how the grammar rules really work. All right, so that's how the learners learn in grammar within the direct method. The other characteristic is that when it comes to literary texts, these examples are, let's say, poetry, short stories, or novels. When they read this type of texts, they do not do it for the sake of analyzing grammar. All right, as we have seen earlier that the grammar is learned inductively. They read only for the enjoyment, for the pleasure, all right, of, for pleasure. That's the reason why they read. And then if they are going to learn grammar, they're going to learn it inductively. Nobody's going to have them analyze grammar in any way. And then also when it comes to the target language culture, the culture of the target language, not the target culture, but the target language, they learn it also inductively. Nobody is going to explicitly say, so this is the culture of English speaking people. All right. So yeah, back in the days, when English was not, let's say, famous, for instance, in many countries, it was not used for communicative purposes. It was not lingua franca. It was not a global language, we'll say. It was mainly used by people who spoke it, and those are the English from the United Kingdom, or the Americans and Canadians. Yes, Canadians. Those were people who were thought as the native speakers of the language. All right, and then when it comes to learning the language, then you will need to learn the culture of, let's say, the Americans, the Canadians, and the English from the UK. When it comes to their culture, you learn it inductively. Nobody is going to explicitly say, what their culture is. You learn it as you read the literary texts, for instance, or whatever text that is being used when it comes to language teaching. And then the next and actually the last point of the characteristics of a direct method is that the teacher needs to be fluent, like really, really fluent, because in the classroom, you do not use the native language. You don't use the native language of the learners. All right, so you need to be very fluent in the target language. So if it were our case, you need to be fluent in English, be at the level of either a native speaker or more, have native-like proficiency. You really need to be very fluent in the language that you are teaching. So that's what now we have under the direct method, and that is the conclusion of the direct method. The last method that we're going to look at is the reform method. And the reform method was created around the same time as the direct method in the 19th century, like the beginning of the 19th century. And influential phonetics focused on the teaching of pronunciation and oral skills because they felt that it was not really covered and focused on in the grammar translation. So reform method, direct method were kind of like a reaction towards grammar translation. And then remember that many of these methods and approaches, when they are created, is because of a reaction towards a certain method that was created earlier, because they think that there is something lacking within that method. So in this case, the reform people thought that pronunciation and oral skills are missing, so let's just create a new approach, because grammar translation didn't cover that. All right, so that's what they have. And then, as you can see, direct method is also a reaction because grammar translation was focused so much on reading, translation, you understand, and grammar. But then there was the aspect of the speaking, the oral, the spoken oral that is missing. That's why they have created this new method. All right. Now, coming back to reform method, that is the reason why it was created, because they thought that oral skills, enunciations were lacking, all right? And then this reform movement, it led to the establishment of the International Phonetic Association. All right, this is very important for us because it still does exist. And I wonder if you guys do know the IPA. So this is now the International Phonetic Alphabet. So the International Phonetic Alphabet was created by the association to be used within this reform method. And then the APA is this one. I wonder if you still you are still using this, because I remember when I was still an undergrad back in the days, how many years ago? All right, we used to have this IPA diagrams that we need to to work with. So what are now the key characteristics of the reform method, reform movement is that oral skills are the main focus, and then as early as possible, like from the very beginning, they should be focused on more than the other skills. All right, and the language teachers need to use the phonetics in their teaching. So the phonetics, they need to use this phonetic alphabet when it comes to teaching. All right, they need to teach that to the learners. Like when it comes to pronunciation, so how do you say this word? This is how you say it. Open your mouth this way, and then, do you understand? So those are the things that they have to use in the classroom. And the teacher, for him or her to really pull off this lesson or pull off his teaching using this method, they need to have excellent phonetic, not phonetic, but phonetic training. All right, they need to have excellent, really, really good training when it comes to phonetics for them to be able to teach it. And the learners should be given, the basic training of phonetic training, so that they can have, establish really good speech habits, so that they can pronounce correctly, so they can speak perfectly, basically have good speech habits. All right, so that's what we have now regarding this reform method. Right? Okay, let's say this is the sixth one. The fifth one is the one on what you think of your thought, whether we should learn the history of language teaching or not. All right. So the sixth activity we have here is for you to match the following approaches to the correct characteristics. So we have looked at the grammar translation approach. We have looked at the direct method and then the reform method. Now you have to match them with these characteristics. Which one goes with which? All right. Uses the IPA in language teaching and learning of oral skills. And then the second characteristic is exposes the learners to as much target language as possible, so that they can learn grammar and culture of the target language intuitively. And then the third one involves the changing of sentences from one language to another. So you need to match those. All right, so let's recap. What did we cover today? So we looked at the definition by Anthony of approach, method, and technique. Definition of method, which is divided into approach, design, and procedure by Richards and Rogers. And then why learners use the history of language teaching. Approaches and methods that we've looked at today is grammar translation, direct method, and reform movement. And that's basically the end of our first lesson. If you have any questions, please post them on discussion forum. I have done so much talking. I wish I had this class communicating face to face. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lesson.